have Dick Whitney. He's with Carl Zeiss Vision and the Optical Heritage Museum in Southbridge. His talk is called American Optical, looking back at its amazing optical contributions. Let me just read his bio in case people didn't take the time to do that. He graduated from the University of Massachusetts Amherst in '73 with a BS in astronomy. Started work with American Optical in Southbridge in their central testing lab. And it's not a coincidence that he started at American Optical. You'll hear about that. And he's recently celebrated his 46th year of continuous service with what is now Carl Zeiss Vision. Dick chairs the Vision Council's Lens Technical Committee, a role he has held since 1997. He has been very active in ANSI and ISO standards work since 1991. He's chair of ANSI Z80.1 Spectacle Lens Committee. And he was inducted to the Vision Council Hall of Fame, in September of 2016. He is also the executive director of the Zeiss-sponsored Optical Heritage Museum in Southbridge, which you'll hear a lot about. The museum was founded in 1983 to celebrate AO's 150th anniversary. Dick has worked to restart it and grow it for nearly 20 years, and thanks to Zeiss, it reopened 7 years ago. I visited it last fall. He gave me a personal socially distanced tour last fall, this spring. The museum houses the largest collection of AO, American Optical, historical artifacts in the world. Dick is a longtime resident of Southbridge, and he's involved in a wide variety of community activities. And you'll hear that he comes from a great AO family. Personally, this is really interesting to me because, this was Dick's first job out of college, and I actually went to AO on my first job out of college a couple of years before, 3 years before Dick got there, and Beethoven was still only 200.
Wow.
So anyway, I spent 6 years at AO, and there were 6 good years. It was a very interesting place, and I appreciate it more now than I did back then, I have to say. So I won't spend any more time, waste any more of your time. If you have questions, I think we'll have to use the chat. You can type them in right at the time using the chat function, or you can hold them until the end of the talk, and maybe we'll figure out how to let you talk. I think there's a hand raising thing that we can use. So if you can keep yourself on mute during the talk, that would be a good idea. And so I'm going to stop sharing then and let Dick begin. You're on your way, Dick.
Everyone see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for the intro, Peter. Makes me feel real old when you read my bio. But anyhow, I started in 1974. My father had been working at American Optical in 1947, and I'll go to that in a minute. But this talk, I was trying to figure out, what do I say? Well, it's about the museum, about AO, but certainly I want to talk about some of the optical contributions given this group especially. I thought I'd, focus on that, pardon the pun, but this picture, by the way, is kind of our logo, but that's a model from the 1955 Shep Early frame collection. But the museum, as you'll learn, is sponsored by Zeiss, but it's a nonprofit separate entity. So this is kind of what I want to cover. Now, cover some of the heritage of that. And Peter, I was fascinated. He shared with the Optical Society, the charter members, with my father was one of them. And I wanted to go into more about the museum, and certainly everyone's invited, especially when COVID is better. I'll be going into an event I plan that I'd love to have you come on to, but I want to talk about some of the ophthalmic industry history, some of the major contributions, and then specifically the lensometer, because there are some experts on this call, but that is 100 years ago. Next year is the 100th anniversary of its introduction. Then there's kind of taut AO, fiber optics, and lasers. Kind of those three I thought would be of special interest. But I also have a few video clips that I'll show So you'll kind of get a feel for what's in the museum. But in any case, that's what I hope to cover. So this is to prove I was cute once, but this is my mother, me, and my sister in front of the AO main plant in Southbridge. That facade is still there. It's now a hotel and conference center, but this, my father had just gotten out of work, and that's in 1954. Everyone can still hear me, right? I can't tell, but yeah, good. Okay,
Yeah, you're fine, Dick.
okay. And this, I got a real chuckle out of when I look back at, but this is the black and white picture in the right is me. I was a real handsome guy there when I started AO in 1974. That was my desk in the central test lab. And notice I had some astronomy pictures up there of pictures I took, but that was my desk. But then the color picture, I had the honor, but it was a tough situation when really I had to close down the cement building. It's called 2L now 50. And that building we were closing, but this was my same desk in 2006, and I still had the pictures on the wall that I had from 1974, so I couldn't resist a then and now. So that's me, and that's where my first job was, in the central test lab. And I learned one of my first jobs was to write how to use the lensometer, standard laboratory procedures. So it's kind of ironic that that's what I'm still talking about now and dealing with in standards and ANSI standards. As he said, I chair the spectacle lens committee. And we still talk about dosimeters, and I'll talk about that more later. But so that's me then and now, although I've gotten older and fatter than that. But that's kind of a fun picture for me. Then I'd be remiss, but much of what I know and the lensometer, measuring lenses, optics was from my father. And when I first joined the company in 1974, I could not work in the same division as him. I ultimately, as he became a consultant in the 80s, worked with him and a guy named Dave Lamar, who was a wonderful teacher and unfortunately died of a heart attack in 91. But Dave Lamar, he and my father, worked on aspheric lens design, working with the IBM PC and doing ray tracing that way. And that was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. And Dave was my boss, but my father was still sort of my teacher. And ironically, my father chaired the lens technical committee of the Vision Council at the time. It was the OMA. And I chair the lens technical committee. He was on ANSI Z80, and I'm on ANSI. Well, I chair ANSI Z80 now, so my hat's off to him. But that's my father and me in Martha's Vineyard on the left. So I have to say, I have AO in my blood, even though now my company is Zeiss, who was a competitor of AO. When the hotel reopened, they tore down the main plant and built a hotel and conference center. When it reopened in 2002, I organized the first meeting, first function. And this is an AO reunion that I held, and I'm in the front. But there you got Walt Sigmund there, you got Bernie Groman in the back, John Davis. You know, I'm really glad I did that because I really had quite an event. We had a lot of work put into that, but that one was really memorable for me to have done that. And I learned so much. John Young was there, and it just was a fun time. But I have done, until COVID, I have done small AO reunion luncheons. And after this is all over, I'd like to say I'll do it again. And maybe it's been at the hotel, and it dwindled down from 60 to 40 to 20. And, you know, I was doing those every 6 months since Milt Freeman used to do it at a place called Rom's in Sturbridge, but I kept it going until last year. And I got to say, I didn't know it was going to be the last one. I'd like to do it one more time. So maybe we'll have a big party and invite all you guys to come, because it's a lot of fun, and we reminisce and talk about what AO was, but friendships we made. So this is the American Optical Complex in Southbridge that I know so well. This is a postcard from 1965. And on the next slide, it'll show what they are, but I just want to show you in this picture. So in the very left, in fact, can you see my pointer?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, well, that's good. So this building right here is the AO main plant that they tore down. All these buildings were knocked down. This center building was retained in the very front wall, but everything else was knocked down. They actually took the road and put it on the other side of this building. This was the print shop. It became a college later. Over here is now shot fiber optics, the original AO fiber optics, but that's shot. Over here was the warehouse, the frame plant, which became safety, which then now empty, but I'll tell you more about what's going to happen to this facility, but I'm right now saying what it was. This is the research building that I spent time in. AO Tech later, but that's the research. Todd AO was developed there, and there's a famous picture I'll show you later. And this is the building, the cement building that I have spent most of my career in. And that's, I think, where Marty and Peter worked, for one, on the 4th floor right there. My father had an office right over here. But this building was built in 1910 along with the powerhouse here. And it's the largest all-concrete building in the United States at the time. And it's very unusual in its architecture. I hope it gets saved. Right now, if you're ever in Southbridge, they have a beautiful snowflake pattern projected onto the front of the building. It's really great. The owners of the complex now are truly trying to market it, and I can go into that later. But moving along, down here was glass research at the time. And the glass plant right there, it had a claw in it as a vent for making the molten glass. Down here was the glass research. This was Casedale here, molded plastics at the time that I remember. But as you can see, this is quite a large 47-acre area. The Quinnebog River runs through. There's a dam there, but was almost totally devastated and destroyed over the flood of 1955. So anyhow, this kind of shows what those places were in the different buildings that I described, but the cement building, the warehouse frame plant, main plant, as you could see, there were like 15 or so different sub-buildings within the main plant. And it was kind of a maze of buildings that they really couldn't utilize, so they tore it down and rebuilt it as a conference center. It's beautiful. And if you ever want to stay in Southbridge, our Southbridge Hotel and Conference Center now, it's wonderful. Indoor pool, and when you can with COVID, there's exercise area and a restaurant, but they're hurting at the moment, but I think they'll survive. And it's a great place, and I hope to have a meeting and an event there next year that you'll be invited to. Hope I'm not going too fast, but
Dick, I just wanted to say that that 2L building, the cement building that you say,
this one.
that was pretty much filled with glass polishing machines, right?
Well, not just, yeah. But one thing that I'll talk about, and I don't think I've mentioned in the talk, but I'll mention now, right down on this first floor was called the Glass Executive Bifocal area.
Mm-hmm.
And the Glass Executive Bifocal was made there from 1952 to 2005. And while your question, they had various things. There was isochronic lens making, there was different, the test lab, research, manufacturing, offices. It wasn't all just making the lens.
Mm-hmm.
But this building, at the Glass Executive Bifocal was made from that period. It was the most successful. It's the long bifocal. It's got a line across the whole lens. It's what Ben Franklin invented, basically. It's attributed to invent. And it was made, and the most interesting thing in the museum is we have a letter saying that President Kennedy ordered 3 pair, and we got the order the day he was shot. So it's like, that gives me chills when we have it. But it was our most successful product line, and was always, they never could move it to Mexico because it was just as much of an art as a science. So did I answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. And 7L was also lens grinding, I think, right?
It was a various thing. I remember molded plastics. They made rouge down there in the basement. It
Yeah.
was a huge building, so there was lens grinding there. Yeah. The original lens plant, I think, was this one. Before they built this one in 1910. And the story when they built the lens plant was two of the three Wells sons were arguing about where to build the new building, and one of them said to the other, "Let's throw it across the pond in the marsh." That's what they did. That was a marshy area, and they built it. They were arguing, and they ended up designing and building it. So that's been my career. But we even had halide casting. We had in the main plant. There was molded the first polycarbonate manufacturing. I remember right over here. It was quite a complex and quite a college if you were there. But this was the research building that I remember especially. I would love to have the museum back there, but it needs work. Now you can't read it too well, but Pete, and thank you, Peter kind of went over this with me and said, I think you ought to talk about X, Y, and Z. One of the things he brought up is, what about all the other plants? Well, Southbridge had a big facility, and this was 1960, when was this? 1965. But it shows we had a Brattleboro plant that was safety. And the building in Brattleboro actually is the same building as the frame plant in Southbridge, exactly the same. If you go off exit 3 on Brattleboro, you'll still see the building there, and it's identical to the one in Southbridge. But we also had Buffalo. That's, oops, wait a minute. Reichert, Reichert Instruments was the AO. Buffalo was the original manufacturing. We had Putnam, Keene, Frederick until 1983. My second father, Bob Haynes, kind of ran the Frederick plant. Chelsea out of near Boston. So we had a variety of plants. And then we had 300 or so laboratories around the country, which as AO went down slowly, and that's a story in of itself, they broken up, but also we were broken up by the government for antitrust as well. So that was part of the story. But there was a work, and then globally we had London, Brazil, all of the world, China. So it was a very expansive, largest optical company, eyeglass optical company in the world. Interestingly, larger than my competitor, the competitor at the time, Zeiss, who now bought AO. So thanks to Peter, who took us some of what I did and kind of massaged down to show some of the more key points. But I just wanted to show, so the company was born in Southbridge on the corner of Main and Central Street when William Beecher started tinkering on his second floor of his jewelry shop with making silver spectacles. And that's considered to be the birth. It wasn't, however, until 1869 that the name American Optical came and was founded, and George Wells, who joined in the early 1860s at the age of 17, later worked his way up to become president. And he was a driving force of the company until his death in 1912. But you'll learn more about the Wells family and their prominence and importance. But he really was the one that got AO off the ground and was an inventor. AO 1884, we started making lenses, but we couldn't really compete financially until, interestingly enough, 1886, tariffs were put on Zeiss product, so we could then more profitably sell. And we got into the lens making. There was a fireworks celebration in Southbridge on the common across from the main plant to say, now we're going to start with lenses. And we became the biggest lens maker in the world. Now in 18, we adopted the toric, the diopter standard, and also we first started making toric lenses. Those are ophthalmic lenses that had cylinder in them to account for astigmatism in your eye. We standardized with a set of power lenses in 1898, and by 1907 we had 2,000 workers. AO established its research division in 1909. And then a key point, Doc Tillian, which I'll be talking more about, he was not really a doctor, actually. He was an honorary doctor, but he was called Doc. And he was an inventor, 165 patents, brilliant scientist, and even worked on the atomic bomb, which I talked about. We supplied everything from World War I to all the wars. I was involved in Desert Storm, but all the wars, the war efforts, AO. In fact, the frame plant that I talked about was built by the government. I think AO paid $1 to have it built or something. It was a government-sponsored thing during World War II, although it didn't actually open until after the war. But the importance of eye refraction and we had mobile devices in the war. Lensometer went onto the field, and we supplied during all the wars. Now, 1921 was 100 years ago. I'm going to be talking much more about the lensometer, and I'm talking about an event next year for that. But we introduced the lensometer, which has been developed over a number of years. But that really changed the name of the game in spectacle lens dispensing. The earliest progressive power lens was patented by Estelle Glancy, who I'll talk more about, but she was hired by Doc Tillian, and I'll talk more later. Tillian patents an ophthalmic lens. His greatest achievement in the spectacle lens was improving the optics for off-axis performance in best base curve choice, corrected curved lenses, which I'll talk more about. But we acquired Spencer Lens Company, and that's why our AO Buffalo started the safety division. I mean, not safety, instrument division, microscopes.
Yeah, it was kind of a head-to-head competitor with Bausch and Lomb in microscopes, industrial and scientific
The
microscopes.
big three were Bausch and Lomb, AO, and Zeiss. In fact, I should have put in the presentation, I have pictures from 1907 where they met in in Rochester, New York, Selfridge, Mass, and Jena, Germany. Tillian developed the additive phoropter. And then AR coatings, actually Zeiss first developed, but it was during the war. But they came out with a coating first, but we were also developing AR anti-reflection coating. We didn't really get off the ground to use them in spectacle lenses until the 60s, and they really took off in the 80s and 90s and are commonplace now. Gun sights, Tillian worked on the atomic bomb even. Monoplex eye, prosthetic eyes started in 45. Contact lens development in 46. Now, production of curved Polaroid lenses, but we were doing Polaroid back in the 30s actually, but we got into Polaroid lenses during that period as well. And then my father helped in the mid 50s on CR39, that's Columbia resin 39 from PPG, that was developed for shields on airplanes, windows. But it's so ideal in making a spectacle lens that other than its abrasion resistance, it's as good as glass and better in shatter resistance. So really it took off. It's lightweight, and its optical performance is almost as good as glass. You can dope it for UV protection better than glass. And it started to really take off in 1971 when President Nixon signed a law on impact resistance, which I'm kind of an expert on, but we still deal with that law today. So every lens worn in the United States is tested by an AO developed test, actually. That's law now. 1953, I think I got that right. Jeff, jump in, but fiber optics started, really the CIA was looking for a method of coding and coding messages. So they hired a man named Will Hicks from North Carolina and brought him up here. And really the birthplace of fiber optics development, I guess you would say, was Southbridge. And more about that a little later. But Dr. Brian O'Brien from University of Rochester came to Southbridge and led, fiber optics and taught AO development. More on that later. 1955, taught AO widescreen technology, Oklahoma. Fecker Company large telescopes. We got involved with that. And Dr. Elias Schnitzer, which invents the indeed glass laser, fiber optic laser. And I believe it was by 64, he introduced the fiber optic amplifier, which we'll talk more about that. And Jeff Hecht actually honored Dr. Schnitzer and Will Hicks in Southbridge in 2012. I'll talk more about that later. AO's fiber optics division started in 1963. Medical division in Bedford, Mass, I think worked on that. Robert Ennis, somebody mentioned Robert Ennis. He was involved in that whole development. And then Warner Lambert buys AO. I'd say the beginning of the end in a way, because they were Pfizer. They did not really understand that, for one, ophthalmic optics isn't pharmaceutical profits. And they didn't understand that, look at all this old equipment and, let's get all new equipment, but they didn't understand optics, and, they sold it in 1983 for $30 million, and subsequently it got sold off. Each division got sold off. I'll talk more about that. 1975, let's see, the progressive power, Dr. John Winthrop, I should talk more about that, but was the first to introduce. We started making lenses, and John Davis, who hired my father, had a patent on a spheric lens design. The non-contact tonometer was developed by Bernie Groman and I forgot Alan, who somebody else on the call worked with him on that. But the non-contact tonometer really was a game changer because it brought the fact that you didn't have to have an ophthalmologist to detect glaucoma. 1979 was the start of downsizing, I would say, for American Optical, and we sold for $6 million the platinum in the glass plant and sold off the glass plant and glass making. I have the last glass made in Southbridge. And then they closed the Frederick, Maryland frame plant, end of frame production. And if I have a murder story about frames if I get to the end and we have time, but ask me another time. But it's really frame making was quite interesting. And we had a plant near an airport, so they could fly from the Southbridge airport down to Frederick and walk out of the plane, walk right into the plant. Warner Lambert sells AO in 1983 to Mo and Rudy. It was like a holding company. There were two men. And that's a long story, but I'll touch upon it shortly. 1983 was the birth of the museum, of the 150th anniversary of AO. Remember, I said it was 1833 it was founded. And John Young, who he was inducted into the Hall of Fame the same year I was, and it meant a lot. He's since passed away. The soft contact lens Framingham division got sold to Sibagagi. They bought the solution and shut everything else down. So that's how that one disappeared. AO Safety division gets sold to Cabot. Now here's a good example, just so you know. AO sells, Mo sells, he bought everything for 30 million. He sells that one for 120 million. Then it gets bought by Cabot for 500 million. Then 3M buys it for 1.2 billion. And it's totally gone now. There is no more AO Safety. It's all 3M. So I kind of scratched my head, but that's what happens to a company when it gets bought. Just like Zeiss, I'm thankful to Zeiss, but the AO name is pretty much gone and taken over by Zeiss. So they are the sponsor of the museum, and they're maintaining the optical heritage here. But when a company buys you, it kind of absorbs the heritage. Luckily, Zeiss is promoting this heritage, but it didn't happen in 3M. Nobody remembers AO Safety anymore, which is sad. That's just what happened. 1992, I helped move the manufacturing and the automatic lensometer, which was after yours. I moved that in 83 down to Mexico. So it started in 83, but the move didn't fully end until finally it was mold making that they moved in 1992. That was the last, once they moved that, it was all done. Then you just had then you had marketing, but once you move manufacturing away, then you're all done. So in 1996, this is how it became to Zeiss. The ophthalmic group that I'm still involved in was sold to SOLA, Scientific Optical Laboratories of Australia, is what that is. In fact, my boss is from Australia, Karen Roberts, and she's high up now in Zeiss. But there's a whole contingent of Zeiss workers in Australia, and that's why. Our headquarters are now in San Diego for the US division. That's where AO had its headquarters, and then SOLA moved its headquarters, and then Zeiss developed its headquarters. Now we're, things are happening because of COVID, but we're still in San Diego. Now, the redevelopment of Southbridge campus begins, and there's exciting new things happening on the campus in Southbridge, but it's not, somebody once looked at the demolition of the AO main plant and said, they can't knock down that building. If they do, AO will never come back. Well, obviously it won't, but people didn't understand what was happening. But it was tough for the town, and we're only recovering now, I would say. It's been a long haul. When a company like AO leaves, we had 5,500 people in Southbridge and 13,000 around the world. Now I'm the last one of the eyeglass division. Now you do have short fiber optics, but basically that's it. And, we recovered, but it was one of the reasons I felt so strongly about keeping all this stuff is I could see it all going away. And I'm kind of a sentimental guy, and where my father and I both worked there, I said, well, as I got upset with things happening, I said, well, I'll work on the AO scanning of documents and other things. And I just lucked out, as you'll learn shortly. Oh, and a little side note, George Wells, who I mentioned, died in 1912. Unfortunately, but he invested in a schooner, and Pete actually put this slide together, built up in Maine, and it actually crashed off the coast of North Carolina. Luckily, after George Wells died, and it was in 1913, but that's, believe it or not, a tidbit of knowledge of the history of AO. George Wells had his fingers in a lot of things. Okay, so now this is kind of fun for me. When I saw Peter contacted me and actually said, hey, I got a list of names of, I didn't even know my father was on the charter membership group, but he started sharing me the names of people. And outside of this, the guy second from the left, who was Alan Jewell, a friend of ours, these are all on the charter members from AO. So you had Marcel Benjamin, who worked in lens design, John Davis, who hired my father, worked with Tillian Lens. I'll tell you more about him. Henry Fernald, he and my father's on the very left, Don Whitney. Henry Fernald and my father worked doing ray tracing, slide rule calculations of ray tracing through a lens at oblique angles. And they both would do the same calculation. And after a day and a half, if they each came up with the same answer, they were pretty assured that that's what it was. So that was my father's first jump. And what I'm so fortunate to have been trained in is, fortunately, I work with my father, but he was trained by Tillian Lens and John Davis. And one of the things I got to say, I'm on the ISO committee for US optical standards and ANSI standards. And last year we were sitting in Southbridge, which I'll tell you more about that, and we're talking about why you measure a bifocal the way you do in a lensometer. Nobody knew, only because, and I had been taught by my father, who was taught by Tillian Lens, who developed the whole procedure as to why. When you measure a bifocal, you have to turn it around in a fosimeter. And they were all talking, well, I don't know, is that really important? Yes, it is. And I showed them why. But so I'm thinking to myself, Tillian Lens taught me, even though I knew Dr. Tillian sort of, but I never met Dr. Lens. But I knew John Davis well. And he was a great teacher too. He was a character. He later worked with my father when they went to Gentex Optics, which is an offshoot. That's now Essilor, but that's in Dudley, Mass. And he lived in Woodstock, and I interviewed him right before he died. And he was also chairman of the Sunglass Committee, ANSI Standards. And I sat on his committee too, so it's kind of a small world. So, but those are the charter members, AO. So 4 of the 5 right there of the OSA New England chapter, I guess. So here are some of the names that Pete came up with. Marcel Benjamin, Charles Campbell, ophthalmologist. Henry Cole was the other guy I was trying to think of, but I have a video of him with Walt Sigmund talking about Todd AO. I could send you that. I have a link to that. It's on YouTube, I think. I can send you that if you're interested. John Davis, of course, was famous in ophthalmic optics and worked with Tillian Lens and taught my father. Mark Dreyfus worked on light filters. Dr. Charles Ellis, you'll see a slide in a minute, but I just realized we're scanning a lot of AO newses and I suddenly found, oh, there's a blood separating device he worked on while at AO. Henry Fernald, as I mentioned. Roy Gunter, while he was really not an AO employee, I think he worked at WPI or whatever, but he worked, oh no, sorry, Clark, Holy Cross. But he worked with Tillier and worked on Todd AO, so I threw him in there. Cless Robbins, I think he was in AO frames, and my father, Ron Whitney. So there's Dr. Charles Ellis and the blood separating machine in 1951. So a little bit about the museum. Presently, we've been housed in this building, and actually the entrance, interestingly, is here, and I'm talking from right in here. But the museum, I have an office right here. The museum houses this second floor right there. And it's quite a, thanks to Zeiss again, primary sponsor. I thought it was going to last 1 year. They've been sponsoring us for now 8 years. So it's great. We do have steps. There was an elevator right here that's not working, but we do have those steps to enter. But I helped found this business group right here. And this is a meeting of the business group as we're about to enter the museum. And we have a brochure put together by the marketing team in Australia. But I show you this because this is kind of the layout. You walk in, we have an AO instrument room, spectacle frames, safety, a miscellaneous collection, ophthalmic. That was going to be a Southbridge history, but then we have, I'm trying to remember which room that is. That's a whole collection of safety eyewear as well. And we even have, I have more fiber optics and lasers down in here. It was quite an expansive area. And just so you see, I have a little video which I'll show you. This is walking through the hallway of the middle part of the museum, but you can kind of see down. We had a moon display because AO Zeiss was first on the moon camera and frames. But this is looking into the spectacle frame room. Antique spectacle. By the way, all these displays are by volunteers. So I'm really proud of that fact too. So you can kind of get a feel for the size of that. Now we have a board. I have a couple other videos later I'll show you, but we have a board. I'm the executive director. I call my, John Young said, call yourself an executive director. So that's what I am. But I have my boss who's at Zeiss is the board chair. Now there's a coworker that houses, she's with Zeiss, but also formerly AO, and she works with me. She's our treasurer. Then Diane Maddock, who's been working for a good 10 years and has brought the Opticians Association of Mass to Southbridge in the museum every year for the last 10 years. I'm really thankful for their efforts. And Keith Gross from PPG, he's a coworker and a standards guy with me. And then two new members, Kerry Wilson, who runs the quality in Walmart Optical, and Scott Shapiro, who now owns the AO Sunglass, now Europa. He moved it from Southbridge to Chicago last year, but he's a real supporter and I'm thrilled to have. So we have a real strong board. So I'm very pleased with that. The highlight of my career, however, was when, as I said, I'm on the Spectacle Lens Committee at International Standards. It's called TC 172 Working Group 3. We had an interim meeting where these countries all came to see the museum. We had meetings, but the reason it was here is the guy from Australia says, Dick, we got to have a meeting in Southbridge. So I organized the TC 172 meeting. And I got to say, by the way, the Southbridge Hotel, if you're looking for meetings, it's a wonderful place. It's designed for the government, for Defense Department meetings, and it's state of the art. So But this was in front of the AO complex at 14 Mechanic Street. And that's traditionally the front door, but the museum originally was right on the right as you walk in that front door. It was a small room. And those are the countries that they came from just to see the museum. Now, Doc Tillier, I decided I'd kind of be talking through a lot about him in many aspects of many slides, but there's a great write-up in the Optics and Photonics November 2004 issue that noticed his birthday card writing on the right they used as an illustration. But that's Doc in a classic form. He was quite a character. He started in 1916 and he worked until the mid 70s and was known driving around town, crashing into cars and paying whoever he hit. He was a real character, but a wonderful man, 165 patents. And there's a real write-up. I'll talk more about him in a minute, but I just wanted to say that Doc Tillier is kind of the #1 scientist that when we think of, as I said, he was just so well respected and so creative. And there was one story, my father worked with him, as I said. And one time my father was tinkering at lunch, not at lunchtime, during work on a radio, because he was a ham radio operator. But he was tinkering with the radio and suddenly he realized Doc was watching him from behind him. And Doc was mad. And so my father said, "Uh-oh, I'm in trouble." And he said, well, he wasn't mad because he was doing that in work. He was mad because he was doing the circuit wrong. So Doc came and said, "Let me show you how to do it." So Doc's invention of the Tillian lens, introduced in 1929, was so famous. There were 6 Norman Rockwell paintings done for that lens to advertise it. This is my favorite. And notice it's one of the few Rockwells that has an AO company logo that he did. But what he's showing, true Rockwell, is a story about optics. Now here, the guy with the Tillian lenses can see his cards, and the guy here doesn't have them and can't read them. So a classic, but there were 6 great paintings done. This one was taken by Warner Lambert, unfortunately. Ultimately sold off. It went for $1.2 million about 10 years ago. I wrote an article on the March 7th, 2017. Anyone wants it, I can, if it's legal, provide a copy back. But Dr. Glancy was hired by Doc Tillier in 1918. She was a true physicist, doctorate. She got a degree, University of Caltech, California, went to University of Argentina to work as a woman astronomer. And she ultimately left there because she couldn't get promoted as a woman. So she came to Southbridge and got hired and took a job there. And she, I gotta say, she was deaf. She was really worked on calculations. She did 10 years of design work for the Tillian lens. Never really got the credit that I think she deserves, so I'm giving it to her now. But she was outstanding. She worked on the lensometer, worked on optics for Plano eyewear, for pilot's goggles, worked on lenses for the atomic bomb, worked on the junior lensometer I'll talk more about in a minute. But I just like to promote her especially. There she is, and I see those books that they're looking at. I have those books now. But that's Dr. Glancy and Doc Tillier working in the lens design area. Obviously in the books of her calculations and his calculation. And what Dr. Glancy, ironically, is really well known for now. At the time, I think she came out and got the US patent for the progressive lens. And I wrote an article on why didn't that come out sooner. And I think a lot of my reasoning is it's hard to make, but aside from that, a progressive lens has inferior optics really than you can get You can get much better optics with, let's say, a flat top bifocal or something, except you have a line. This has no line. But at the time of this making, we had, you must have the best optics possible. And for one, it was difficult to make this lens, but two, you don't get the best optics. But it's a compromise, and you're probably all now wearing progressive lenses because they're damn good now, but there was a lot of development. But still, it's not the best optics. You compromise your optics somewhere in the no line. But she has the patent, 1924. So there's Tillian, Glancy, and Davis. And that's kind of, that probably was in the late 40s, early 50s. And as I say, I feel honored to have learned through my father what they taught. All right, and I got to really say, I worked with Dr. Winthrop, who was my boss, along with Dave Lamar, but Dr. Winthrop designed all of these progressive lenses. And I got to say, I'm old enough, but I worked on them all and actually designed the Pro Easy with Dr. Winthrop. He came out with what they call the Dirichlet principle for the True Vision that he presented to my father, and my father was unimpressed, but it became the ultimate design tool where Dirichlet defines the temperature gradients between two poles of a different temperature. When you mathematically define how nature disperses the temperatures, Dr. Winthrop said, well, nothing can be better than nature. Let's disperse the power and the gradients of power to the same way that temperature would do. And that's what he used for all those other lens designs. And I got to say, I think we had the best lens designs there were. The AO Compact in '98 saved the company for another 10 years because it was a bifocal for small frames. And even though when he came out with the Omni in '88, Dr. Winthrop said, I can't do any better than that because he spread out the distortion everywhere. And he said, I can't do better than that, but he did because that wasn't the best balance. So those are just, I'm honored to have worked on them. And Dr. Winthrop was shown there at a meeting describing the design principle. So some of the contributions that AO, we're not getting to, I guess I got to speed up. Let me know if I'm going too slow. Ophthalmic optics, eyeglass frames, safety eyewear, fiber optics, military contributions, instruments, medical devices, and Todd AO. There are many firsts, like I said, the corrected curve, the Glancy bifocal. First photochromic lens, plastic, was Photolite. We did the AO bifocal, the executive bifocal, the Franklin style, Permalite, abrasion coatings, the compact lens that I mentioned. And there are a number of safety product firsts. But we had the first safety goggles in 1906. When they had no windshields in their cars, also, we had the first driving goggles. So that shows some of the collection. And this is a little movie just to show you this room. The drop ball unit over here, I'm an expert in that, but AO developed the drop ball, as I mentioned. Microscopes. This is an invention of George Wells's from 1863 to draw eye wire. Kind of gives you a flavor in the museum. So some of the instrument firsts are the lensometer, the phoropter, additive trial sets, non-contact tonometer. In fact, this is a delivery of the non-contact tonometer from a guy from Buffalo. The man pacemaker and even solid state lasers. So I just got to give a tribute to Bernie Groman. This is a tribute to him. Unfortunately, he was struck and killed by a car in Buffalo in the early 2000s. Ironically, didn't see the car, I guess, but the non-contact tonometer, he had tons of other patents though too. And I worked with him on ISO standards, and he worked with my father as well, but I think some of you did work with him. Great man, nice person, and inventor. So I had to give tribute to him. So now I want to talk about the lensometer. The lensometer, I hope to have an event next year at this time. I'm now beginning to plan it because I think by October, November, we can be certain that we'll be a little safer with COVID. So I'm going on that assumption. We were to have an event in October this year. but the ASME group in December last year nominated and approved the lensometer as a landmark invention for mechanical engineering. So what about the lensometer? At first, we actually started developing off the Trotman device in 1914 that we bought. But Tillian and Glancy worked on the lensometer, and other scientists subsequent to that. That's the lensometer in the museum. And critical to the lensometer's success was what I feel this is my most treasured thing in the whole museum. Dr. Tillian calibrated these lenses in 1916 before he came to the company, and they were used to calibrate the lensometers. They're the dioptric true lens, true power standards. There is a write-up in 1916 about it, and there's the case now. And what they are, we have lenses of known curvature. One was flat, the other curved. And notice there's a little slice taken out of each lens. They knew the thickness and they measured the index. So knowing the curves, thickness, and index, they knew the power. And Doc calibrated them. In 1978, we recertified two, but this is the only set in the world that I'm aware of that are calibrated to the Bureau. So this is an advertising when Doc Tillian was involved and we were ready to introduce the lensometer in 1921. The 1921 model had this U-shaped horseshoe on it. But what was so key about this is it was the first time you could verify a prescription practically in the field. Prior to that, it was not so easy. They even once dispensed lenses by the age of a person. So 1938 model became the standard, and Dr. Glancy worked on that, and they added the table and the marking device. That basically is still the unit today, and the accuracy is just as good today. More about the lensometer instrument. The junior lensometer sold in 1947 for $300, went up to 1958 to $435, but Dr. Glancy and Tillian worked on that. And then my father, in 1956, worked with Bob Haynes and who else? Trying to think who else was involved on this electronic lensometer, which never was made, but it was devised and written up. So I had to give a tip of the hat to that, but then we'll talk more about other lensometers. So in 1960 thereabouts, this is an off-axis lensometer that I have in the museum now. But basically it had a sodium light here, a telescope, you put the lens on and swivel it, and then it would measure as you swivel the lens, the off-axis, tangential, and sagittal power errors, and you'd have a printout of the errors. So that was used in the Masterpiece lens especially. And I guess I didn't show this one that I have another one in the similar device. But if you want to talk about this, but Peter, Marty, and you worked on this, and ironically, this automatic lensometer was put in the factory at the A-Light casting to package lenses. And my first job was to develop standards for that device and calibrate it. So I guess I didn't know I was running into you guys then. But if you want to say anything about that, but it was quite an achievement. And I remember we called them the EO1, 2, and there were 3 different lensometers. And of course, they played the games in the factory about if it didn't pass on one, you'd ship it to the other one. And you still but you do that today with other devices, so it wasn't a device. But I learned a lot about optics and measurement from that. So my hat's off to you guys.
Well, thanks, Dick. I don't want to talk much about that, but I do want to say about lensometers that it's this great analog optical thing where it's moving a target linearly on a rack and pinion. And that position is proportional to optical power because the lens you're measuring is mounted exactly the focal length in front of the standard lens that's inside the instrument. So the whole process of calibrating it is really interesting. You've got a couple of adjustments that you can do to obviously the zero adjust by turning the wheel, and you can change the scale factor of diopters per millimeter by changing the focal length of the interior lens in the instrument, and you can change the linearity by moving the height of the nose where the lens is sitting. So it's a very clever device. I don't want to say anymore. I'm wasting too much
Uh,
of your time, but
oh,
it's
I
really
will say my first business trip was Buffalo to learn how to calibrate the units as well. And this isn't the best picture, but the birth of the museum rebirth was this day when I had everything in storage and I hauled out all the lensometers. One on the right really isn't a lensometer, that's a prism device. But this is the lineage of lensometers. There's the one I was talking about, that's another, but these are all the lensometers of AO by the decades. And I put that up for a hotel meeting and I got noticed, and then it was from there. So this is in the room. Oh, this is another video, I guess. Did I already show this or no? So there's the original lensometer. That's actually the case from the original founder of the company, but there's the off-axis unit. And you can see it pretty well. This is a reflection lensometer to measure curvature, and those are curvature standards. So this does not do transmission, this does curvature. And that was my other early measurement training. So Todd AO, I hope I'm not running too far behind, but Todd AO, widescreen movie projection. The first movie was Oklahoma. And Brian O'Brien was running both this project and fiber optics. And while this was a success, I would say it was a failure in another way, and it detracted from fiber optics, but he was running both. And what is Todd AO? Todd AO, and this is from if you ever want to know about it, a 70 millimeter in 70mm.com from Denmark. Everything you always want to know, but including interviews with Walt Sigmund. But basically, it was projecting an image onto a curved screen, down and curved, so that when you saw it, it was undistorted. So each film wrap was distorted. And its debut was 1955, October, 2 months after we had a flood. My father took that picture. Some of the selected films were Oklahoma, Around the World in 80 Days. It morphed. It wasn't the same Todd AO by the time you get the sound of it. It was 70 millimeter though. And you still see the name Todd AO now, but it's different. But the first two were that. So this was this was in Southbridge, Mike Todd, Brian O'Brien Jr., Oscar Hammerstein meeting in Southbridge. And there it is, developed by American Optical. This is Life magazine, came to Southbridge. It was a big deal. That's Brian O'Brien and Mike Todd. And this is a gift I have in the museum from Mike Todd to Brian O'Brien. It's a transistor radio. And this is a meeting I had in '97 where you have Walt Sigmund, John Davis, Brian O'Brien Jr., and that's the size of the camera, by the way. We met in Southbridge, and actually John Davis was on a flight and didn't know who what the actress is. Elizabeth Taylor was sitting next to him, married to Mike Todd. She was coming up to Southbridge, I guess, and he didn't know who she was. But they started talking. In any case, getting to five. So I know I'm rushing. I'm just cognizant I'm late, but I want to hopefully skip over the importance of Todd AO. It still was a major project, and they did what they did in that short amount of time was amazing. But the birth of fiber optics, as I said, Brian O'Brien joins in '53. I hope I got it right. Then CIA hires Will Hicks. And then there are many achievements, but the one that I want to talk about and Jeff Heck came for, there was a single mode wavelength patent, but the fiber optic amplifier. There's Jeff standing and with his City of Light. If you don't have the book, you ought to get it, but his book on fiber optics. But this stone recognizes Elias Schnitz's achievement in the IEEE contacted me and said, you know, we want to recognize this achievement as being one of the top 100 inventions of all time. They felt it was like the light bulb in in its importance. And so what we said is in 1961, he constructed the first fiber optic amplifier laser in the former AO complex. 3 years later, he demonstrated fiber optic amplifier. So we dedicated that in 2012. Here is one of my AO reunions, but at the time there was Will Hicks, Walt Sigmund, and another friend. But we also gave tribute, and Jeff Heck gave a little plaque to Will honoring his achievements in fiber optics. I think the story goes, I think I learned from the book of Jeff's, is after 3 years of work, he was on his first vacation in North Carolina, lying on the beach, and he suddenly realized what he'd been working on to scramble a message wouldn't work. So he told the government it wouldn't work, and they shut down the contract. So that was Will. So there's Jeff giving Will the plaque before his death. I'm glad we did that. And that's unveiling of the plaque for the family of Elias Schnitzer, daughter Helen Parrott. So first of all, lasers and fiber optics, one of the story Jeff tells also is because they weren't paying attention to the patent date filings, and there was a patent in Europe, and they misread the date because it was in European format, and they thought they had until December, but it expired in June, I think. So mistakes like that happened. And perhaps because of Todd AO, they were distracted, but a lot of great work was done in Southbridge. What I really didn't understand until very recently was laser development team. And there was a guy named Bill Shiner who just passed away, but he was involved, and he provided me with a lot of this history before his death. There was a guy named Fred Hayes who I worked on with the ALite packaging and the automatic lensometers in later dates, but this was the laser team. And they came, there's Bill Shiner, and there's the team met in the museum in 2018. I was trying to get support for expanding the laser area, which I did somewhat, but I still would like to do more of. But Bill Shiner provided this, which is kind of cool. So Elias Schnitzer developed the first glass laser, first fiber optic laser. These are all AO developments. Fiber laser amplifier, first sun-powered laser, first ranging one off the moon, 2 switching laser. We set the world's record for 5,000 joules in a single pulse from a glass laser. Supplied a large oscillator amplifier system, numerous lasers for cutting and drilling, coagulator, fiber laser. And we exited the laser business in '73, and there were spin-offs. Bill was saying how they just could not get AO to invest. They said, well, where's the immediate payback? There wasn't. So it was a big business, but unless it paid back, they weren't interested. So we also put this together of some of the application first and how it's used today. And, I can provide this to you. It's too lengthy to go through, but I'm really glad he put this together before his death, and he supplied me with other materials. So I'm glad that happened. And we have, Peter mentioned, glass laser. I have 2 kits. I remember Dave Lamar had one of them, but I have his and another kit. The laser doesn't work anymore, but we use a pen laser. And it was a good teaching device, and it was an optics training kit. So you could do some, you could show the reflection of light. And that's one of the kits in our museum. So I went a little longer than thought, but I encourage you to come to the museum. I thought I had another video, but we're on one favor you could do for me is like us on Facebook, Twitter, or, go to the website. We're going to improve the website. I think it's great now, but we're going to do more interactive movie stuff. We're also digitizing books and photos, and I'm hopeful that eventually we'll have like a little membership. I would like to do a way to fundraise, because right now we're basically totally funded almost totally by Zeiss, and I'd like to expand, but we need money. It takes a lot of money. But right now at the moment, there's no entrance fee. open whenever. I know nights and weekends, and I can do COVID-friendly tours at the moment, although maybe we want to wait a month or two. But mask required at this point and social distance. But I can open at nights and weekends, and when we're a little further along, I'd love to have you personally come. Who's ever interested? It's in Southbridge, Mass, off of Main Street, and I don't know if you have any specific questions, but just please share us on Facebook or whatever, and the more traffic, the better. Was there anything in particular? Any questions?
The first questions from John Briggs. Can you comment at the end about the connection between the very early Spencer company and AO? Spencer made some early telescopes as well as their microscopes.
I do know I believe I have, they had meetings with Spencer Lens in the 20s. They were business partners, but we bought Spencer Lens in 1935, I believe.
Yeah, Spencer was established.
Oh yeah,
by the time AO bought it.
We bought the business. And there you go, AO buys Spencer Lens and it becomes AO.
Yeah, but I think they were still calling them, some of the optics were labeled Spencer later.
Yeah, for a while. I'm just saying in the end, that's what happens. But
yeah,
they were wise to keep that name for a period of time.
And then they had this association with Reichert, wasn't that a
well, see, then AO Buffalo, AO Instruments got sold in like 80, what was it, maybe 79, 80, forgot what the date was, but so that got spun off. Bernie Grumman went to work for them and others, but then AO gets bought by Reichert eventually. Okay. And now they're, so if you look up Reichert is what it, but that's now owned by another company, but it's still called Reichert.
Yeah, all right. I thought there were Reichert microscope things in the catalog even when I was there in the 70s, but
not that I have the catalogs, I'll look, but okay. I don't remember that.
All right, next question. Just what did the blood separator do? Did it involve optics in the separation?
I don't know. All I know is this. Let me see if I can blow it up a little. So let's see. Where was that? Charles Ellis. Where's my sec? Oh, there it is. Sorry. It's, I'll read it. It says, shown above, undergoing tests is new blood separating device resulting from Dr. Cohen research at Harvard University Laboratory for Physical Chemistry related to medicine. The test was conducted by Harvard and assistant Dr. Cohen and Charles Ellis, AO engineer, who collaborated with Cohen in building the device. I don't know much beyond that, but I'll have to look into it. But it was, separating out, I don't know, the plasma. I'm not sure, but that's what they're involved in. But I just discovered that the other day.
Because Dr. What was his name? Ellis?
What's that? Cohen?
Was it
Cohen?
He was but the AO guy was Dr. Ellis, right? And he
Dr. Ellis, Charles Ellis. So it was a collaboration effort in that case.
All right, next question. Dan Rundlet asks, where did the items in the collection come from? And did AO keep a good archive of items over its history?
Well, yes. I mean, we have the largest collection of pince-nez in the world, which is because George Wells, those are the ones that clip on your nose. I have, well, to answer your question, they were put aside. Much of it, the core of the collection, even the paintings, we have some great paintings, was saved from 1983. John Young kind of scrounged through, and the company put up with putting a collection together of devices like the first lensometer, like different things, and they were put in a room in a collection. Then that got less and less people visited the museum when less and less people visited the main plant. When they tore down the building, you would not want to see how it was moved. And they had paintings before I got involved up against a radiator. I mean, just thrown together in a room. People were walking over glass negatives. It was chaos because they moved it from the main plant to the research building in one small room. then when I did so anyone wants to look at older website, Dick Whitney, American Optical History. I want to gravitate that over to the museum website, but there's a lot of stuff there. But when 2001 came and they were tearing it down, Mo, the owner of the company, noticed my work in documenting the demolition of the building and my website. And they said, "Do you want to be curator?" And I said, "Sure." But I had no place for it, no money, nothing. It was in storage. And then eventually, when I moved out of the building in 2005, I had moved some stuff. I had no place to put it. So literally a friend of mine, I moved my office to a church on the main street. And, oh, I could show you, but if anyone wants, I got some slides on that, but I don't want to be long-winded, but I have a whole presentation on that. And on the third floor in the attic was stored the museum for another 5 years, and it was bats flying around and no heat, and unbelievable. But then I was just about to give up, and I said to my boss in Australia, "You know, I got to do something, and I don't know what I'm going to do." But I moved all the instruments out of the cement building, the test lab. I saved a lot of that stuff, and I gave talks in New York about potential for a museum, but I had no place for it. And then she said, "Well, maybe Zeiss will sponsor it," and they have, and thank God. Because for one, we have a great place. I'd like to move and expand, but secondly, if that hadn't happened, nobody would be recognizing what's in the collection, and it would have been dispersed, moved away, sold off. So if whatever happens to me, I think now people see it. I just got to keep it going a little longer. And then I think it's got legs, so I'm hopeful it'll continue, but support me by talking it up, and when you can, come visit, and, you know, looking for ideas on future growth. I have a potential move. If I could afford it, I'd move too, but it's just money and time.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I answered your question.
Dick, Dan Rundlet, whose question that was, just says, "Thanks for all your great work." And
No, thank you.
I would echo that. It's an amazing accomplishment.
A lot of luck.
Sorry?
A lot of luck and you know, determination, but a lot of luck, I'm telling you.
Determination, I would say. Yeah, Groot Gregory made a comment, which I was going to try to make as well. The New England section of OSA, this organization, owns one of those laser teaching kits, and it's in our outreach suitcases. And the question I have for Groot is, does the laser still work?
Ours didn't. Maybe yours does, but ours didn't.
I don't know, Groot. If you're there, you could.
It did a couple years ago.
Did it really?
Yeah, it works.
Fantastic. That's great.
Well, you've got maybe the only one. That's really good.
You could use any old laser, but it's kind of cool that it's still the
Yeah, and I didn't.
original
I have a guy that knows lasers, but I didn't want to touch him. You know, holography. We had the holography on display for a while, but even had a Playboy Playmate type holographic image, but I couldn't display it in the museum. But
well, all in all, I think the company was just amazingly impressive back in the day. Like when I was there, like, you know, they had all the ophthalmic stuff, and then they had the microscope making stuff, which is a whole nother company all by itself. They bought a company called Fecker Optical, I think we mentioned it, in Pittsburgh, and their specialty was making large telescopes and tracking scopes for the military, and it's just amazing how diverse they were. And then this research division was basically a world-class, you know, physics optics research group, just like in a university. And out of it comes things like the neodymium glass laser, and it's very impressive.
I just got to show you a couple quick images. So this happens to be the corridor. At the time, I didn't know what I was doing, but I was trying to get a group together for a museum, and ironically, it was in the same building I now am in. But then, and that's the way it was stored in one of the moves. So that's a lot of the crap. And that's the building I moved to that got restored. And we had in the attic of that building, the museum. And then we had displays for a long time because I had no place to move. That's Charles Prentice. If you know Charles Prentice optics, you know, Prentice's rule. And he was also optician. and he worked on trial lens sets. That's his trial lens set that AO gave him from 1900 thereabouts. And then this was the birth of the museum when my German colleagues and my boss came to Southbridge, and that's what it was like in the attic. And then we opened, we planned, and that's as we got open. We've had, anyway, that kind of shows you the evolution.
Questions?
I don't have a question, but among the documents I got from Bernie Grolman are handwritten letters by when Spencer Lens would send microscopes to microscopists around the country for critiques on how good they were, how well they were designed. And this is a critique letter that came back to Spencer Lens from one of their microscopes from a microscopist I think it was at the University of Colorado. But there's a lot of good stuff in there.
What was the date on that one? Do you have a?
Early 1900s, maybe even or late 1800s.
Oh my God! Well, you let me know when my number and email. Just anyone wants my number, actually, I'll give it to you to call me because that's the best way. 774-230-8016. It's on the website. If you go to the opticalheritagemuseum.com, you'll see it there. But and you can get a hold of me through an email there. But
yeah, or you can write to the New England section. We'll forward it.
Yeah, forward it.
I'll get in touch
really
with. I'll get in touch with you. Yeah, I've been storing this stuff now for 10 years, so I'd like to get it out of my barn, which is not a cow barn, but it's stored well.
What town are you in? What?
Carlisle, Mass.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Great. All right. Any other questions? One or two? No. Dick, thank you so much. It was just great to hear and see all that stuff.
Thanks for all your help. He's been real working with me for a week. So
it's been fun. You've been reminding me about people that I haven't thought about in a long
Peter,
time.
I think Ken Brecher may be raising his hand.
Oh, I'm sorry. Just unmute yourself and speak. Ken Brecher? There you are, but you're muted. Let me see if I can unmute you. There, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Barely.
Barely?
There, that's better.
Better? Okay,
yes.
Better. Two questions. Essentially, everybody looking right now is wearing progressive glasses, as far as I can tell.
No.
But I bet that none of us has ever heard of Anne Estelle Glancy. Why is that?
Well, for one, as I said, I wrote an article. I'd be glad to share it, except it was for the, I wrote an article. Actually, it wasn't published yet, so I could send it to you guys on why I think they didn't make it. But Dr. Glancy, probably she was allowed, I'm sure she worked on the invention, but she was allowed to assign it, I think, probably by Tillian. Otherwise, I got to think he would have taken the pad because they probably thought it was impractical. And as I said, to make a progressive lens, it took years of development to really get it right. But this was a time, the Tillian lens had just come out, or about to come out. This was a time where everything was the best you could possibly be in optics. You know, the corrected curve, the optics, when you look off from the center, was well corrected. Everything was, you got to have no interruption of vision. Even the optics in exact bifocal is good, except you have an image. Well, you have a ledge, so you see the jump. But you can't do better than that, really. Although I had an idiot guy that was my boss in the 80s saying he could design a progressive with no distortion anywhere. Well, it's sort of like saying, I know, you know, that's totally baloney. Anybody that knows optics knows you can't do that. But so when you design a progressive lens, you have to push the optics and the distortion somewhere. And it was that learning curve. And early on, it was, you know, we used slumping methods to make the lens from Tillian. He did round block slumping and, you know, aspheric work. There was a lot of technology in it, but it was not simple.